probably those who are not presenting, mute your microphones so that the quality of the connection is better. Also, you know, turn off your phones. But otherwise, let's start. And I welcome our first paper by Caroline Schlaufer, Artem Uldanov, Victor Albert, Dilara Gafurova, and Maria Makhmutova. Narratives for or against change, a narratives policy framework perspective on policy debates in Moscow.
Okay, I guess I start, right?
Yes.
I will present for all of our co-authors. We figured it is easier to, in this online regime, to just have one presenter. I have prepared a presentation, which I will share with you all. So thanks everybody for being here. We actually want to present the research of our research and study group, or Научно-учебная группа, NUG, which started in January, February this year, with the title Narratives for or Against Change, a narrative policy framework perspective on policy debates in Moscow. So our NUG is quite big. We have 4 lecturers and professors from the public policy department. Yeah, actually, for those who don't know me, my name is Caroline Schlaufer. I work as a professor in the public policy department. And we have 12 students who help us, who participate in our NUG. And the objective today is that we present what we are doing. As we only started in the beginning of this year, we don't have yet many results. So the focus of the presentation will be on the theoretical framework, on our methods of data collection and data analysis. But we already have a few results that I would like to share with you. So as you heard, as you can see, the research project is about narratives, about policy narratives. Now, narratives or stories, they have become increasingly important in public policy research, but also in other fields. And the reason for this is that research has shown that people often use stories to make sense of the world, to communicate, and also to make decisions. So this is the basic assumption of our research, that narratives are influential in policy processes. For example, different policy debates in parliaments, but also speeches of politicians, campaigns by activists, NGOs, they're often full of stories or narratives. In public policy, in recent years, a framework has been developed. It is called the Narrative Policy Framework, or short NPF. And the objective of this framework is to study the role of narratives in the policy process. Now, the purpose of our research and study group is to apply this NPF to policy debates in Moscow. And we have selected 3 salient policy debates in recent years. This is the housing renovation program, so the Renovation, transport policy with big public transport policy reforms under the Sobyanin government, and waste management policy, the whole garbage problem and policies that have been decided and started to be implemented in this context. Our purpose is to test whether this framework is applicable in a new context, because it has been developed in the context of the US. It has been mainly applied to liberal democracies, and we would like to see how we can apply it to policy debates in Moscow. Of course, our interest is also in these debates. So we also like to see how do actors communicate about these 3 issues. Our research question is, well, the first one, we have other ones, but the presentation focuses on this one, is what policy narratives and narrative strategies are used in these debates. And we assume that there is usually 2 sides, governmental side that promotes these policies and certain policies and programs, and a more critical side that is against, puts arguments forward against these changes. A few words on the narrative policy framework. The NPF is above all a theoretical framework, so it has specific assumptions. It puts forward hypotheses that have been tested in different studies. And these hypotheses focus on the role of narratives in the policy process. Secondly, the NPF is also a guidance on how to empirically study narratives. And in this sense, it is a quantitative approach. So it uses quantitative methods to study stories, which might sound a little bit weird. How does the NPF propose to do that? So the assumption is that narratives, independently of what the story is about and in what context the story is told, they have always the same elements in it. And these elements can be analyzed, and it can also be analyzed how many of these elements are used in a narrative. The most important ones are a setting in which the story is told, different characters, so villains, they're responsible for a policy problem. We have heroes who solve a problem, and we have victims, those who suffer, or beneficiaries who benefit of policies. Stories have also different plots and a moral of the story, which is usually the policy solution put forward. Now, as I said, the NPF assumes that policy actors have different narrative and narrative strategies depending on what side of the issue they're on. We can imagine this like that we have a group of policy actors, they have a preference. For example, promote environmental friendly public transport, electrobuses, for example. We will have another group of actors who have a different policy preference. For example, promote private transport with more roads, more parking spaces, and so on. These policies, we can have a third group and a fourth group as well. These policy actors, they use narratives and different strategies to advocate for their preferred policy preference. And depending on many factors, this can lead to a different policy output. Now, our focus will be on this strategic use of policy narratives of both sides of a debate. We have hypotheses. We didn't invent them ourselves. We deduced them from the NPF. So the NPF provides you with hypotheses. And I have just here a selection that I want to focus on. Usually, so we deduced from the NPF the hypothesis that actors who are in favor of the official position will use heroes and beneficiaries, while actors who are more critical of the official position will use villains and victims. Then we have different plots. One plot is called a control story that we assume, or we hypothesize that the governmental actors will use. A control story says that yes, we can control things, yes, we can change things, as opposed to a decline story that focuses on problem, everything is getting bad, everything is getting worse. There's also narrative strategies that we will look at about containing conflicts and expanding conflicts. I skipped this part a little bit because I won't show results on that yet. Now, how do we go about to test these hypotheses? As I said, we have three single cases of these three debates, Renovation, transport, and waste, but we also planning on doing comparative analysis across these cases. Our method is quantitative and qualitative content analysis of texts that we find on websites and social media. We selected texts and we coded them using a systematic coding scheme where we searched the texts for these characters, heroes, villains, for different policy problems, for different solutions and different plots. So here an overview on type of texts we use. So here we have the governmental position. We took governmental websites, media, and social media. On the opposing side, we checked websites for different NGOs, opposition politicians, bloggers, citizen groups, and so on. Overall, we included in the analysis 764 texts. So as I said, we coded in text just to show you a little bit how that looks like. So we have here all the texts, and we looked at different variables. Who are the heroes? How many heroes we have? For example, what are also qualitative? What is the proposed solution? How is the problem defined, and so on. We also assessed intercoder reliability because we had so many coders. We had to see, do they code more or less the same way? And we achieved a satisfactory score. And then we analyzed these variables with simple descriptive statistics. We looked at distributions and correlations of categorical variables. Just shortly, our first results. So we can show that the governmental really uses statistically significantly more heroes and beneficiaries, while critical actors use more villains and victims. Governmental actors also use more control stories, and critical actors more decline stories. However, they have also quite a high score of using control stories themselves. Control stories means that solutions are put forward, that the focus of the story is on change can happen. I'm already towards the end, but I see that I still have a bit more time. So just quickly to show you, maybe this is how our results will look like. So we checked how many heroes on average are used in a text. So the governmental side has, for example, more than one hero per text, but not a lot of villains, not a lot of victims. We also checked who are these heroes. The government uses, for example, themselves as a hero, Sobyanin as a hero, while the opposing side uses NGOs, citizens, opposition politicians. We have done the same thing for villains. Government doesn't use a lot of villains. Here's the total score. For victims, beneficiaries, and so on. So thanks a lot. What are our next steps? We have to continue our statistical analysis. Of course, we have to analyze across cases to see, well, what is the difference between these cases, and we want to analyze also a qualitative analysis. So thanks a lot. Yes, any questions, comments are of course welcome.
Thank you very much for presenting this piece. So I guess we will first hear all the presentations and then go to Q&A if this is discussions, if this is okay with everyone. So the next paper is, I believe, on a very similar topic by Aleksandrov from HSE and Georgi Tarasenko. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, I will start and one will continue. Just 1 second, please. Okay. So you can see the slides, yeah? Okay. So we'd like to present not maybe a paper, but our project on renovation, metro and sidewalks, and how does authoritarian modernization affect electoral outcomes. So briefly about the motivation of our study. So it's an intersection of 2 topics: the role of redistributive politics and infrastructural projects and how they can shape urban policy and in particular regional electoral policies. And here Moscow is a very interesting case because of so-called uneven development led by new, not already new, but yeah, Mayor Sergei Sobyanin. And at the same time, we are interested in still in the role of election within electoral, or you can call it informational authoritarian settings. And Moscow also here is a very interesting case because of the repeated attempts at coordinating from the side of opposition. For example, in 2030 mayoral election, 2017 municipal election, and last 2019 Moscow City Parliament election. So I don't think I will talk a lot about theory because we don't have time and we want to talk a lot more about empirics. But yeah, so here is a interesting piece, the results of the latest election. So left map is 2014, Moscow City Parliament election, 2019 the last election in the regional parliament, and the right map shows the ratio between opposition and incumbent candidates, and we can easily see that the support for opposition is drastically grew during 5 years. So we are sort of interested to look what sort of determinants can influence this electoral outcome besides protest and strategic voting that is widely considered. And we try to concentrate on 3 urban policies under Mayor Sergei Sobyanin: roadworks, in particular sidewalk fix campaign, metro expansion, and program of housing renovation, and try to measure somehow their electoral input. I will skip that. So a lot of literature on allocation of public investments tells us that incumbents prefer vote-on or rent-seeking strategies while allocating public investments, in particular investments in public infrastructure, to obtain, for example, votes or to strengthen the loyalty of their traditional supporters. And infrastructure projects here offers a good rent-seeking opportunity, and we want to consider them. So what do we know about some sort of empirical studies? Under democratic settings, there are a few studies that show that there are some positive implications on pro-incumbent vote in case of investments in bridges and highways in the US, in case of metro construction in Madrid, and sort of reaction measures, so governmental reaction to some extraordinary situations like LB flooding in Germany, for example. And under authoritarian settings, there are also some results. For example, positive implications on loyal incumbent vote in Seoul in the case of metro construction, and in Russia in the case of 2010 forest fires. And therefore found positive implications on support of government after some extraordinary aid was provided. And in China also higher expansion of metro is associated with larger chances of mayor promotion in cities. And we here in our paper, in our project, we argue that the ethics is highly dependent on the scope of duration of the project. We have to consider the role of corruption, clientelism, and patronage relationship in these settings. And we argue that in the case of authoritarian modernization, incumbent risk to be unable to signal his competence in infrastructure project realization. That's why the effect of different projects can vary depending on their completion and the expected utility to citizens, city dwellers. And we hypothesize that these 3 policies have different effects, whereas larger exposure to roadworks is negatively associated with loyal pro-incumbent votes. New metro had an opposite positive impact, and we assume that there is no statistically significant association with higher exposure to housing renovation program, because as lots of literature says that lots of houses that were included in this program were selected strategically, for example, to escape some sort of protest, or renovation was sort of tool to reward more loyal voters, etc. And moving to the empirical part, first hypothesis, we tried to test on the higher exposure to roadworks. And I will not talk a lot about this program. I think lots of people already know about it. Basically, it's about massive road repairs, including sidewalk renovations that are a part of so-called My Street program that were launched in 2015. And there are different opposite views on that program. On the one hand, Moscow, typically for all post-socialist cities, suffers from underdevelopment of road infrastructure. And the opposite side, these road work repairs are connected to corruption and clientelism, and which is also typical for such cities. And we collect data on roadworks from official website, Moscow Open Data Portal. And so you can see it in the map. And so we see that from year to year, the exposure is getting higher. And we try to estimate this in regression settings where our dependent variable is changing votes for either pro-mayor candidate or opposition. And okay. And our main independent variable here is higher exposure to roadworks. And what we actually see that the correlation, this is our regression model, is pretty robust. And according to our hypothesis, high exposure to roadworks is negatively associated to change in pro-mayor voting and positively with change in every opposition voting. Then we try to do it for the metro expansion. As we see from this graph, during the office of Mayor Sergei Sadanin, the number of new metro stations has grown dramatically. You can see it on this map. So this map are precincts, избирательные участки, where new metro was launched, depending on the degree of their proximity. And we try to use this information also to estimate the effect. We try to measure the degree of proximity of every single polling station to new metro using a very close regression setting. And we actually find the completely opposite effect that we predicted according to our hypothesis. So proximity to new metro is negatively associated with pro-mayor voting and positively with opposition. But when we control it for distance to old metro, the results remain more consistent with the hypothesis. So, for example, precincts that were more far from these stations are likely to reward incumbent for that. And finally, talking about, small visualization, talking about renovation, I think Ivan can join,
and talking about renovation, we think, and we tested the hypothesis in respect to renovation as a kind of pragmatic redistribution program. Next slide, please. Yes, we focused on the fact that actually there are studies that indicate that the program had some redistribution nature, and it was targeted at specific groups of population, and there is actually some evidence that it affected the mayoral elections that were held just after the renovation program was launched. So we decided to test whether these effects are persistent towards the Duma elections. Next slide, please. So we decided to make a very close regression setting as well. And let's turn to the results for this section, to regression analysis. we measured renovation through both binary treatment, whether precinct belongs to renovation or not, through population share living in renovated 5-story buildings, and as a robustness check, renovation as a share of houses belonging to the program. And what we found is that the pro-mayor and pro-turnout effects of renovation that we could identify for mayoral elections did not hold for Moscow City Duma elections. And what mattered here is that renovation seems to have decreased the support of both opposition, like the best opposition, and the challenger, the communist challenger, which is slightly different from what we predicted here. And I think that we should jump to the conclusions, to the overall conclusions. An important thing here is that the support for incumbent triggered by these infrastructure policies does not actually mean that the policies are going to hurt opposition and vice versa. So opposition's fragmenting matters. So this is not a binary choice whether you support the incumbent or not. And what we found, to sum up, is that there is positive association between metro construction and incumbency, negative association for roadworks, and some interesting finding about renovation, because it seems to negatively affect the support for opposition. But this is just work in progress, and we're trying to develop a more sound identification strategy to address the endogeneity concerns here, because, well, if this is a targeted program, then we have to think more about that. And we are actually performing some placebo tests to test whether we have something to account for, something else to account for in this situation. I think that's all.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So now we are turning to 3 papers that will be more about Russian regions and elites. So the next paper will be by Ivанов, and the title is Столяр, about Phaeton-clientelism as a factor for formation of the Russian gubernatorial corps.
Hello. I'm going to introduce rather our research project, not a completed work, but still we have some results that could be interesting for you. Moving on. As for discussion, we have pretty intensive polemic on Russian gubernatorial corpus, because we observe different periods in Russian regional politics. The first period of Putin's, the first Putin's term was pretty stable, and we knew a lot about criteria on that governors were fired. And the key criteria were stability in the region, absence of inter-elite conflicts within the region, and that's pretty all. Economic performance was not that important, because oil prices grew up dramatically, so it allowed federal authorities to support even not that effective managers in the regions. After that, after Beslan tragedy, as you may know, direct elections were abolished, and after that, Varangians, it's Russian term that means governors who are not related with the region before were appointed with the accordance of regional legislature. So it continued since 2005. Elections were abolished in 2004, but the procedure stopped since 2005, and it continued until 2012 after protests in Moscow and in other Russian big cities. Putin agreed to reinstall elections of governors in Russian regions, with the few exceptions like Caucasus regions and Khanty-Mansiysk, Yamalo-Nenetsky district and Nenetsky district that are dependent on their maternal regions. I don't know how to express that. But the scheme was pretty sly, because new curators, new supervisors of home and regional policy, they offered the following scheme. When newly appointed interim governor got a lot of support and image support, financial support, and so on, and it allowed them. I have some periods, and it allowed them to get good results during elections, and this system exists until now. Yeah, and discussion was related with these periods when scholars discussed some advantages and disadvantages of all these systems. Yeah, and now since 2005, after the Beslan tragedy, when governors were appointed, and until now, federal actors like high-rank officials, high-rank political managers, and the heads of state-owned corporations interfered in the process of appointing governors directly, because the system allowed them to interfere in this process. So our assumption was that this indirect approach creates an opportunity for them to promote members of their clienteles, of their patron-client networks for gubernatorial corpus, and expand gubernatorial representation of these influential patrons, federal patrons. So we are trying to test this assumption. Yeah, here is our research problem. Yeah, that from the one hand, we could see decay of federal relations, and gubernatorial position was not that important and influential. So it's an era of decay, Russian federalism, when governors joined vertical of power. So governors lose their authority, lose money, and so on. From the other side, now we see shrinking federal budget, shrinking opportunities. So the competition among federal patrons is rising up because they are seeking for larger resource base. And in these terms, regions could be a good resource base for them, for their corporations, for their political goals. Yeah, okay. So here you can see the graph. You may see that in recent decade, there were two big waves of gubernatorial changes. The first one was under Medvedev's rule, when he replaced old governors that were members of All Russia Party. Fatherland All Russia Party, it was a bloc of two parties, like Tatarstan, Bashkiria and Kalmykia heads, and Yuri Lushkov, mayor of Moscow. And the second wave started in 2016 when Sergei Kiriyenko was appointed as the deputy head of presidential administration and proposed his program, Leaders of Russia, that is now how to say, the channel to promote governors. Yeah. And as for data and methods, we used two-step approach. The first one, we polled experts and used data from open sources. It helped us to collect some preliminary information and intuitions for further research. After that, we used biography and career intersections in governors' biographies and federal patrons' biographies. Also, we added some new criteria like patrons' actions in favor of client. It could be, for example, a contract between the governor and between the head of federal corporation that sponsor, that promise some money for the region and sponsorship, and so on. So it helped us to establish multiple ties for every governor in Russia. And finally, we see, to sum up, a table for 2019 that shows the great share of political managers and political patrons. The most prominent are Volodin, who was as well deputy head in presidential administration and had some resources to promote his people from his clientele in State Duma, in gubernatorial corpus, and so on. Sobyanin, I didn't mention Sergei Kiriyenko, and so on. We see heads of corporations, as well private business patrons, and as for trends, we see that federal central is not a monolith, yeah, and big groups participate in this competition to promote the governors. But here I should say that it concerns only rich regions and the regions that have good resource base. As for poorly developing regions with bad performance, we see lack of interest from federal level, and these regions actually is a place for, you know, for some politicians who are replaced from federal level, like Ulyukayev's team. When Ulyukayev was arrested and his team was replaced, some members of this team were appointed in Ivanova Oblast and so on. So there is a difference between regions and between motivation in appointing governors, but still most of them utilize their ties with federal patrons and heads of corporations, and this tendency is growing up in recent decades. That's all. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Okay, so now we will have our fourth paper by Israel Marques about intergovernmental transfers in the hybrid settings.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. Okay, well, thank you very much. Just to hop into it, the goal of this paper is to sort of understand how federal governments, particularly in hybrid regimes, place resources with elites. And so, you know, rather than give you a big, long, sort of theoretical motivation, I thought that maybe I could give you all a sort of graphical illustration of the problem. So imagine that you're a rakish young ex-FSB agent who suddenly finds himself in the need to run a series of presidential elections, right? 1, 2, and then Lord knows how many more. And so to do this, you potentially need to take into account other elites within the country that could serve as competitors or that could help you. And sort of the way to crystallize the problem you have is how are you going to spend your money, your federal money, in order to sort of maximize your chances of winning elections and staying in power. And so one sort of group that you could potentially use this money for are people like this guy, Yuri Lushkov, who's a potential competitor. In real Russia, he actually ran a party against then Putin's Unity Party and was seen as a potential competitor for Putin's first election. And so you might send money at him as a way of sort of buying him off and getting him to support you instead. Alternatively, and this of course comes much later in our rakish ex-FSB agent's career, you could instead send money to people that are known quantities. So this is Artyom Gardiev, who at this point was the governor of Voronezh. And this is a man who, you know, Putin worked with extensively within the federal government. He's known by most of the people in the government. He's a known quantity. And so when you give him money, you know what he's going to do with it, right? And so you can think of him as being sort of a more reliable agent than somebody like Lushkov, who harbors sort of his own political ambitions. And that's really the heart of the research question and the motivation here. And I'll talk about more why this is particularly interesting in hybrid regimes in a second. But fundamentally, these intergovernmental governmental transfers are important because they're useful for staying in power. So we know in both democratic and less democratic settings that they're useful for buying turnout or electoral support, as the second paper mentioned as well. But also in cases where your main competition and the main threats to your ability to stay in power come from elites, they can be used. These transfers are important for either providing your allies with resources or rents, or simply to buy off potential opposition. And so to sort of spoil my entire talk, the argument that I'm going to make today, and hopefully the finding that I will convince you of, is that in hybrid regimes, those where elections occur, and they do matter, but they're not necessarily free and fair, and there is a strong element of predictability, there's a very mixed strategy vis-a-vis elites. So it is the case that you, as sort of a federal center, are going to send money to elites. You don't ignore them completely, but you don't target sort of strong elites and potential competitors. You actually target specifically those elites who are known quantities, who are well connected, and who are predictable. But you only do this when they actually need the resources, when their regions themselves are growing slowly, and they're not able to generate what they need to support you in that region. So speaking briefly of sort of the threats to hybrid regimes, the problem in these countries, as I said, is that elections are not always free and fair. There's a strong element of predictability. And so because of that, there are two-edged swords. So on the one hand, the literature on this argues that these elections are used to gather information on the electorate, so you can keep them happy, but also to signal your dominance, to show all potential elites that you can dominate the electoral arena, and there is absolutely no reason that they should oppose you. The problem with these elections is, even though they're very predictable, sometimes you lose. And when you lose, that signals weakness, and it could lead to a cascade of defections and ultimately bring down the regime, either through democratization or something else, as we saw in Mexico at the end of the reign of the PRI party. And sort of one solution that's commonly bandied about in the literature is, well, you more or less control the entire apparatus of government, just commit fraud. But the problem is fraud is costly. It also can provoke its own reactions. And so ideally, your strategy would be such that you actually genuinely win the support of the population, whether that's through sort of traditional programmatic politics, whether it's through clientelism, whether it's through shutting the opposition out of the media so nobody knows who they are. Now, elites are very important in this story because they're crucial to coercion of the opposition, mobilization of voters, or if you believe in the sort of more optimistic story, to economic development that would get you organic support. And the problem is that the defection of these elites from the regime, from the sort of dominant party systems that generally emerge in hybrid regimes, threaten you, because all of a sudden there's this other locus of power, this other place that voters can look to, and it can lose you those important elections. And so transfers are particularly useful vis-a-vis these elites because they provide rents or promotions that can align the incentives of the elites with the regime itself and keep them bought into the system. And it also enables you potentially to use those transfers to generate support in the regions, which cements your electoral dominance and denies the elites sort of potential alternatives which they can use to challenge you. Now, the novel sort of contribution theoretically of this paper is to think of the problem of keeping elites in the regime as actually two separate problems and two separate logics as to why you would give them money. So the sort of classic logic that you see in the literature is that you have these sort of powerful regional or opposition elites who have independent resources, whether that's control of economic resources, firms, oil resources, other assets, whether it's political machines that they can independently mobilize, or the coercive capacity of the state itself within their subnational domains. And so these independent resources make them threatening because if they choose to use these against the regime, it can all of a sudden provoke these sort of threats that can emerge. And so these resources make elites useful, but they potentially give them more money with which to threaten the regime. And so the argument here is, if that's the case, you want to co-opt them to maintain their support. If you end the flow of money, they revolt, and therefore we should see that you always give money to threats. Now the alternative here, sorry, my screen is misbehaving. Here we go. Is to transfer to well-connected elites. And these are those that have informal ties to the leadership. And here there's sort of two mechanisms that I argue. One is that ties couldn't be about information. So you have a sort of principal agent problem where resources can be used for or against you. The more you know people, the more people they're tied to, the more credible they are, the more predictable they are, the less of this principal agent problem you have. But you can also think of these sorts of ties, these sorts of connections, as a lobbying mechanism, because it allows you to sort of shortcut your way through the bureaucracy. Now, as opposed to the threat logic, here, both of these hypotheses are contextual. Right? It's not that you're giving money to these people because they can potentially threaten you. It's because you know something about them, and therefore you're only likely to give them money when you need that. Now it'll become important in a second. Now on to data and measures. So here the dependent variable is growth in federal transfers. De jure, federal transfers are assigned for specific things. De facto, nobody cares. And so there's a lot of work showing that these transfers get spent on whatever basically regional governments want to spend it on. And sort of the main independent variables that I use here for power are the regional experience of the mayor, like the amount of time that they have spent in their region. So building on the sort of previous paper, the fact that these people might have independent power bases they develop, their tenure as governor, which also speaks to their ability to have built up resources, as well as the size of the regional bureaucratic apparatus, which is a coarse but commonly used proxy for the size of political machines. For connections, what we do here is we build a social network using ties between the work histories of governors and federal bureaucrats. Now here, the network itself consists of all executive branch agencies, services, ministries, etc., both the civilian and the military ones, and the governors. And here we have everybody from the sort of executive level down to the vice director level. And what we do is we code their biographies, and we create a tie where people have worked together at the same place at the same time, with the argument that if they're in the same place at the same time, they're more likely to know each other. And the measure that I use here is what's called federal eigenvector centrality. And what it is a weighted measure, not of how many people that you know, but how many people the people you know. So here, right, it's not important that I know Putin directly. It's important that I know 15 people that know the rest of the federal bureaucracy, and through them I can get to Putin. To give you a sense of what that looks like, here we're looking at Valeria Matvienko, who's one of the highest scorers on this eigenvector centrality score. She is the pink here. The green are the people that she's directly connected to. The orange are the people that her connections are connected to. So basically, she ends up knowing almost everybody in the network very, very quickly. In case you're curious, the black dot is the boss, President Putin. So I'm not going to say much about the estimation strategy. We use a dynamic panel model with system GMM. The controls are basically all of the standard things that we know determine federal transfers. There's a wide and established literature on this. And so let me just skip quickly to the results. So this is the sort of interaction effect between economic growth and connections. The blue here are the sort of most well-connected people, somebody like Matvienko. The green here is somebody who has no connections whatsoever. And so the thing that you should see here is that for those that are well-connected, for the median region, in terms of economic growth, you actually get more federal transfers. It's about a 3% difference. However, when economic growth is slower, when you need more resources, when you don't have as much money, that effect becomes even more pronounced. It grows to a 7% difference for regions in the lower 10% range of growth in the lowest decile, right? So what this illustrates is that the connections in fact do matter, but they matter most for those that don't have the resources, that actually might want to go out and lobby, or that might actually need resources to develop electoral support. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this here, but in case you're curious, the magnitude of this effect is relatively similar to what we see when we look at just vote margins, which are traditionally how you assign these transfers for political purposes. So we do a whole host of results and robustness checks on the results. If there's interest, I can talk about those during questions, but I want to focus on the conclusions, right? So here, the finding is that both elites and elections matter, which is something that's mostly important about the paper. But what's interesting about the elites is it's particularly those that are well connected, that have these strong networks, that are the ones that are getting the transfers, and not actually these powerful regional elites. There's no statistical effect of that. What's important to keep in mind here, though, is that this elite story is consistent with several logics, and the data don't really allow us to parse this out, right? So one story is this is about getting your well-connected friends money in regions that are low growth, where they don't have opportunities for rent. It's also consistent with these well-connected people being able to lobby for money to develop the economies of their regions, right? And it's also consistent, again, with this idea that you want to give money to people that will use that money to help you, right? So it's an investment into electoral resources, again, in these regions that are growing slowly where you might particularly need them. And right now we can't really distinguish between this. Now, one thing I'll just say quickly, because I know I might get questions on this, this study cannot account for selection effects. And that's something that needs to be done in the next iteration, right? So it could be the case that the well-connected are getting sent to very specific regions, which would bias the results. Nonetheless, I would argue that what we find here is consistent with the fact that it's not the threatening people that are getting money, but actually those that are well-connected. And then future research needs to look into sort of both the endogeneity implications of that, but also the mechanism. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very interesting and I would say polished paper, but we will discuss that later. Okay, now we are going to our final presenter, Елизавета Корнеева. She will present about the paper about the electoral regional cultures in Russia. So please.
Здравствуйте. Тема моего исследования «Электоральная региональная культура России. Возможные подходы к исследованию». Говоря о проблеме исследования, стоит отметить, что проблема заключается в неоднородности голосования в регионах России. Поэтому целью исследования является разработать классификацию региональных электоральных культур на основе электорального поведения избирателей в регионах России. Говоря о теоретической рамке исследования, стоит отметить, что термин региональная электоральная культура пока не получил достаточно широкого применения среди исследователей в России. Большинство исследователей концентрируется на использовании концепта политическая культура или региональная политическая культура. Однако, если опираться на понятие политическая культура, можно определить значение региональных электоральных культур. В моей работе региональные электоральные культуры означает особенности поведения или сложившиеся паттерны поведения избирателей во время выборов. Методом исследования является кластерный анализ К-средних, и исследование проводилось по результатам 4 федеральных парламентских кампаний с 2003 по 2016 год. В результате исследования все регионы были разделены на 5 территориальных кластеров, для которых характерна определенная электоральная культура. Отнесение каждого региона к какому-либо типу электоральных культур основано на устойчивых повторении электоральных предпочтений в некоторых в нескольких избирательных циклов. То есть для каждой избирательной кампании проводила кластерный анализ, а потом путем сравнения, в какие кластеры попадают регионы, выделяла региональные электоральные культуры. То есть при наличии у региона 3 совпадений в территориальных кластерах можно было сделать вывод о том, что в регионе слабо устойчивая электоральная культура. При появлении 4 совпадений можно было говорить о том, что электоральная культура уже устойчивая. Результаты исследования можно рассматривать с точки зрения концепции территориального градиента. То есть она предполагает о том, что региональная электоральная культура существует ядро, в которое входят те регионы, которые отличаются более высокой гомогенностью голосования. Также после ядра идет периферия, и это регионы электоральной культуры, которые подвержены в большей степени изменению своих политико-электоральных предпочтений. И переходные зоны — это те регионы, которые не попадают ни в один из типов электоральной культуры из-за отсутствия устойчивых совпадений, постоянных совпадений в нескольких электоральных циклах. То есть в результате исследования было выделено 5 электоральных культур. Первое — это лояльная республиканская электоральная культура, для которой характерна повышенная лояльность действующей власти и протестное голосование, видя за другие оппозиционные силы, почти отсутствует. Если говорить о территориальной принадлежности регионов, то это прежде всего регионы Северного Кавказа, а также Республика Мордовия и Тыва. Также стоит отметить, что именно только для данной электоральной культуры характерно ядро, и нет регионов, которые склонны к изменению своих электоральных предпочтений в разных электоральных циклах. Следующее — это умеренно лояльная электоральная культура, которая также характеризуется высокой поддержкой партии власти относительно среднего по стране, но уже имеет пониженные показатели по сравнению с предыдущей. Протестное голосование также возможно проявляться в виде небольших всплесков за голосование левых или националистических сил. Если говорить о территориальном расположении данных регионов, то это части регионов Крайнего Севера, для которых характерен конформизм, и частично регионы бывшего Красного пояса. Следующее — это либеральная электоральная культура, где регионы демонстрируют самые низкие показатели лояльности к действующей власти. При этом преобладает голосование либерального типа. Территориально регионы находятся в северо-западе, также это города федерального значения: Москва, Санкт-Петербург и Свердловская область. Следующая электоральная культура — это коммунистическая. Особенность ее заключается в том, что в этих регионах преобладает левый тип голосования и пониженная лояльность действующей власти. То есть, если смотреть на карте, то можно видеть, что территориально в данную электоральную культуру входят регионы бывшего Красного пояса. И последнее — это национал-популистская электоральная культура. Она характеризуется уверенной поддержкой ЛДПР с пониженным голосованием за левые силы и также, возможно, за средние показатели лояльности к действующей власти. Территориально она представлена на Дальнем Востоке, а также частично входит в регионы Урала, Поволжья и часть регионов Центральной России. Приходя к выводам, можно отметить, что электоральной культуры исследование позволило выявить, что электоральные культуры включают в себя устойчивую часть, которая характеризуется ядром, изменчивую и переходные зоны. Это те регионы, которые не вошли ни в один тип электоральной культуры и для которых характерна постоянная смена своих электоральных предпочтений. Также исследование позволило выявить 2 противоположных типа электоральных предпочтений. С одной стороны, это регионы в разной степени лояльны к действующей власти, и с другой стороны, это наличие регионов, которые характерно протестное голосование, которое выражается в поддержке за разные политические силы. Также стоит отметить, что несмотря на то, что на наличие разнообразных политико-идеологических предпочтений, показатели Единой России во всех электоральных культурах выше, чем показатели всех остальных, показатели других партий. Однако стоит отметить, что это доминирование Единой России может сочетаться с различными повышенными показателями оппозиционными и голосования за различные политико-идеологические силы. Спасибо за внимание.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizaveta. Very interesting. Okay, so we are a little bit ahead of behind the schedule, but I guess that's okay. Well, no one hopefully needs to rush to another session after this one today. So now let's discuss the papers. So Israel will discuss 3 papers and I will discuss 2. So Israel, do you want to start or do you want me to start first?
Why don't I do mine, because with the exception of Elizaveta's papers, mine are already going in the order of the presentations, more or less, anyway.
Yeah, sure.
How long did we agree on for this? Like 5-ish minutes?
Mm-hmm. I guess so.
So colleagues, I'm not going to get to all of my comments, so maybe you guys can email me separately later. You should all have my email, and then if I have anything additionally, I can send it to you. So I'll try to focus on the sort of big picture. So first, for Caroline et al.'s paper, I guess I have I have more questions, I think, than actual comments, because the NPF framework is not something that's familiar to me. And so I should also say that my comments come from a sort of political science background. So obviously cultures and research questions differ. So feel free to just be like that. We don't care about that. But for me, I think the biggest, sorry, and I should also say that the reason I say that is because I think my biggest problems with the paper are not with the paper, they're actually with the NPF itself. So that's why I make all those caveats. So like the biggest sort of issue I had with the framework is that I don't really understand what we mean by the political outcomes here, because originally, like when I was reading, I thought that political outcomes meant actually what policies get made. In which case it becomes very, very important not just to look at the strategies, but to think about the intersection of those strategies with the incentives of the decision makers. And that's something that I wasn't able to get. And I think it's particularly problematic here because, you know, in a democratic setting, you can argue that the audience is the population generally, right? So you influence the population influences the politicians. The politicians either make the right decisions or they pressure the bureaucrats, right? Depending on like what your view of bureaucratic accountability is and what level the decisions are getting made on. In hybrid regimes, it's much more complicated because you don't, like you have an accountability mechanism, but it's not quite that straightforward. And so I think that one of the things that, depending on the goal of the study, one of the things that might be very useful in terms of creating a big contribution for this project is not just testing the NPF to see if it works, but actually thinking through how the NPF would need to shift to account for the dynamics of hybrid regimes. And if you guys want, and if you're not like as familiar with this literature, at least in political science, there's some work, although not a ton, on this, and I'd be happy to forward that to you. And so here it becomes really important to think of like who the audience for these strategies is. How does the audience then intersect with the decision maker? And then how do the specific, like what are the mechanisms by which the strategies themselves, right? The use of the heroes or the villains or the use of various narrative frames shape the audience, right? Like what are the sort of psychological mechanisms at play there? The second big question I had is what the comparison is trying to do, because I think that's also important theoretically. So one view is that the NPF framework says that everybody does the same thing all the time, regardless of the issue area. I mean, I'm just saying this because, again, I don't know the framework, right? But the way the paper is currently structured, that was the assumption I kind of made. If not, if the issue area is important and the issue area changes the strategy, then I think it's important to bring that out so that we understand why these three cases, what specifically is being compared across them, and then how that would map to everything else. And again, I think that that's an even bigger call for thinking through, again, this question of audiences, actors, incentives, et cetera, particularly in hybrids, because, and this is going to preview something I'm going to say to the next paper, right? I think that the nature of the policy is quite important and the expectations of the policy are quite important. In fact, let me jump to the next paper and, you know, keep listening, please, because some of this will apply to your three issues. So moving to the Tarasenko and Aleksandrov paper. So I'm glad that you introduced this as a project and not a paper, because my literal first comment is this is a book project. This is not a paper. But because of that, I think that your instinct to focus on the empirics in the talk was like, okay, congratulations, very technically savvy. But I think that the real contribution here and the real importance of this is going to actually be on the theoretical part. The reason for that is like the framework that you propose is very interesting, but there are all these moving pieces in terms of, so to harken back to Caroline et al.'s paper, right? Here the audience is the population itself, right? You're trying to get them to come out and vote without having to commit fraud or use sort of dirty tricks, right? You want them to just vote for you. And so here you have to think about the fact that there are a bunch of different policies with different time horizons. So I get a promise from the government. Some of that will happen tomorrow. Some of that will happen a year from now. Some of that will happen 10 years from now, right? Depending on which specific thing we're looking at. Also the expected benefits, right? So the metro benefits me if I'm 50 minutes away from the nearest stop and it's going to be now 5 minutes from my house, and much less, as you guys said, right, if there's already a metro stop within walking distance. And then finally, and this is the thing that your framework doesn't account for, but which I'm going to argue is actually explaining why you guys are having trouble identifying effects. There's also externalities, right? So I have a lot of work on the Moscow renovation projects. And one of the things that we find is the people in the buildings are like, this is great, I'm getting a new apartment. And the people in the buildings literally right next to them are like, this is awful, I'm going to be living in a construction zone for God knows how long, right? And so when we think about this, you can also see these externalities when we look at people's reactions to like waste disposal, right? Like if I, in the middle of Moscow, see that there's a landfill in Moskovsky Oblast, it's great for me, it's terrible for the people living next to it, right? And so I think that you need to spend more time thinking about externalities. It's hard to do for this paper because you're using aggregated data. And so there's this ecological inference fallacy, right? So in the neighborhoods where there's a lot of buildings that are under the renovation under the renovation program, right? There's both a ton of people that are benefiting from that because they're going to be moving later, and a ton of people that are, you know, actively inconvenienced. And I would argue the same thing is true for like the Moscow renovation. So like at our local neighborhood meetings, all of the car drivers were complaining about the fact that these sidewalks took up all the parking spaces and now they couldn't park anywhere, right? This matters for many of these things. So I think that you need to think through the framework more clearly and articulate the voter's utility function, because that way I think it'll be clear what your prediction should be, right? As well as what other things need to go into the variables. Because right now it just sort of looks like you guys ran a bunch of regressions and then post facto cobbled something together. Science happens the way it does. I'm not going to judge. But that being said, like I do think that there's a good theoretical framework you can build here. I also think that you guys need to think much more carefully about the role of uncertainty and time horizons. So you mentioned it briefly, but I really do think that this issue of credible commitment, and particularly credible commitment in a hybrid regime, is very, very big in the literature and probably very, very important. Again, and it's important because I think this will help you to articulate why why the effects vary across policy areas. And again, speaking back to Carolyn's paper, this is also, I think, important for you guys in terms of figuring out the strategies, right? Because if the goal is to get support, the concerns then very much affect how you want to talk about it, both as the opposition, but also as the government. Okay, we can, Ivan's actually my newly minted master's student, so we can talk about this more later because I have some more comments on endogeneity and all that stuff too that are important, but may bore people. So finally, Екатерина, я по-русски постараюсь, но извините меня за то, что он как меня не очень всегда по-русски. Но для вас у меня был такой комментарий. Просто я понимаю, что здесь наши регионалисты, есть такое понятие электоральная культура, но если честно скажу, первое, я сомневаюсь, что то, что у вас есть в ваших исследованиях, это именно что они имеются в виду. А второе, я сомневаюсь, если электоральная культура, это даже как какой-нибудь хороший концепт. Но у нас просто мы с Ростислав Феликсович, есть несколько спор на эту тему. Но просто то, что у вас есть фактически, это попытка посмотреть, насколько есть, как правильно по-русски сказать, устойчивая поддержка разных партий. И, извините, на Западе есть литература об этом. Это называется electoral volatility. А здесь может быть что-то связано с культурой, но вы не сможете это мерить только с данными из этого выбора, потому что это может быть связано с политической машиной, который будет коррелированы с то, что вы видите, но это другой концепт, и это ближе к, кстати, культуре. Там тоже, как в моменте, поскольку именно в концепции Ростислав Феликсович внутри регионы вариация тоже очень важно, чтобы понять культуру. В несколько мест политики выглядит одинаково в столице и в деревне, а в несколько регионов там сильно отличается. И просто, опять же, с вашими данными, на уровень региона сложно это все рассчитывать. А я все это скажу, потому что один плюс кластерный анализ, насколько я понимаю методика, я не большой эксперт, это что вы сможете разные данные там все поставить, чтобы получить. И поэтому, как мой совет для дальнейшего развития этого исследования, это подумать по разным интерпретациям, что именно имеется в виду здесь по культуре. Это что-то связано с предпочтением, но тогда надо постараться получить региональные агрегаты public opinion data. А если здесь имеется в виду, как люди голосуют, тогда данные, которые у вас есть, наверное, более мелкий уровень. Или что-то, если это political machines, тогда что-то связано с мобилизацией. Потому что, просто данные, как у вас есть сейчас, это мерит что-то, это полезное мере, но просто это не ясно, что это совпадает с концепцией, которую вы раскрывали, о котором вы писали в начале сам работы, и поэтому это тоже надо скорректировать. Просто это зависит от вашего. Тогда спасибо.
Thank you, Israel, very much for your comments, extensive comments. So right now I will comment probably on 2 other papers, and then we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. So first of all, I'm not that big of an expert on these topics, although I do work on the Russian region. So the reason I am a discussant, well, is because obviously Israel cannot comment on his own paper, and I will also discuss Evgeny and Vitaly's paper. I'll keep it short for the sake of time because I think you guys can have actually more valuable comments from the audience, but still. So first, comments for Evgeny and Vitaly. First of all, I really like the paper, and most importantly, I do buy your main argument. However, I have some questions and suggestion. So as I understood, you have found that having a federal patron is an important predictor for choosing a candidate for a governor. Also, you claim that this is more important than other factors. And I do like that you have, I think you've done a good job listing all the alternatives. However, I do think that you need to supplement your methods with some data and statistical analysis, because, well, pardon me if I didn't understand it correctly, but from what I understood, the method that you are using right now, like the interviews and very preliminary figures, do not allow you to disentangle between alternatives. Well, because as you said, there are many other alternatives why governors can be dismissed, etc., right? So just simple numbers will not do the job. So my first question is, how does your method allow you to establish which factors are more important than others? Also, if it is just interviews, that what you may be finding is actually, opinionated story, not like the real one, although it might be close to reality. And I do think that your main argument actually reflects the reality. I do think that having a patron, a federal patron, is an important factor. So, but still, I would supplement it with data. This is my major comment and suggestion for your paper. As regards Israel's paper, so I really like it. I think that it's a polished piece. I like the main argument, how the paper is structured and placed in the broader context. Also, I won't go into details about the empirics, because I think that the empirical strategy is very clear. The indigeneity problem is tackled. There is an attempt to tackle it by the GMM method and an instrument. And also about the selection method, Israel kind of talked already by himself as a limitation on the paper. So my major question is the following. Although I do understand that we operate in the world of limited resources, still I wonder if like politicians, federal politicians and elites could use several strategies, how they can transfer, or like reasons why they would transfer federal money. Well, especially when we are talking about resource-rich countries like Russia, I mean, in the good times, for example, right? So if the country and an autocrat has enough kind of rents, enough resources, both to distribute, to protesters or potential protesters, also to the well-connected elites. So I think this can be discussed in the paper. Also, I do understand and I do believe that intergovernmental transfers is an important strategy, but I also think that that's one of many strategies that you can kind of use to build support for the regime. So there are different strategies like clientelism, and as regards elections, vote buying and intimidation. For example, intimidation would be even cheaper by definition, right? Because you don't need to transfer money for that. So in this sense, I do understand that it's a little bit further from the main discussion of the paper, but maybe you can mention also this. One problem that I noticed with the analysis or question, that can it be the case that actual economic growth is slower because of the well-connected elites? Because there is broad literature, for example, that companies that are politically connected, they grow slower, for example. And I would assume that maybe it's the same problem with the regions, because if they are well, connected with federal politicians, they don't need economic kind of growth. They know that they will be rewarded anyway. So that's my question. But it's kind of similar to the selection problem. And another idea for empirical analysis would be to control for natural resources in the region, and maybe for regional political regime. Well, but that is arguable, so maybe the first one. I would control for natural resources of the region, because some of that goes, if not formally, to the regional budget, but probably informally. And that might matter a lot for actually, how powerful the elite is. Okay, thank you very much. So now what I suggest is that maybe we do take, we will give time for response, and then we take some questions, or we take some questions first. And maybe for the sake of time, you guys can write your questions in the chat. I think there is an option to export chat so that we can save the questions and comments for the future. I think me or Seni can do that. So do you want to take questions first and then reply along with the comments?
I think that's probably more efficient to take the questions, and then because we are technically already at time, fortunately with this distributed format. So
yeah, but I mean, if we are willing to take questions, then please let's keep it short, but let's do have some questions, and then yes, we will provide some time for response. I mean, and we do understand that if anyone needs to go, that's okay.
Well, may I have a very short question to Israel? It is more than a comment, but how we should distinguish between resourceful people like Matvienko, like Mintimer Shaimiev was, for example, and those who are well connected? Like what is the main distinguished point here? Because sometimes it is quite tricky. Like today I'm resourceful and I'm loyal, and tomorrow I'm potentially dangerous.
Can I also ask a question to Israel? I was wondering, in the empirical part, what is actually the link to elections? What you find out is that well-connected people get more resources. But I don't see the link to elections. I see it in the theoretical part.
sorry, can you repeat the question? I was just writing down our terms.
Sorry. In your empirical part, I was wondering where the link is to the election, because in your theoretical part, you make a link to elections, but in your empirical part, I don't see it. You find out that well-connected people get more resources. I think that's independent, the case, independent of elections or not.
I had a question for Yevgeny's paper, if I may. I was just curious, so I might have missed this in your talk, but I'm curious, like, what are the patrons actually doing for the clients in the regions, right? Because generally when you talk about this literature on patron-client relations, so I was thinking here about the literature on China, for example, right? You as a patron are actively sitting in a spot where you can not just put your candidate forward, but you can actually curate their careers so that they have all of the sort of things necessary to then get promoted up the next step of the ladder. The reason I ask that is because I'm also curious if the things the patron can do for the client then restrict the regions that you can put people in, right? So if we think, for example, of a businessman patron, right? The thing they can do for their client is to ensure that they have access to political machines and resources to sort of promote the interests of the federal government in the region. But then that means that you can only put your patron in one region, which is where you have like your people. Whereas if you think of somebody like Sobyanin, who can, you know, just get you federal money regardless of where you get stuck, right? He can put his people into a lot wider ranges. And so just theoretically, I'm curious about not just generally what the patrons are doing, but if some of this variation comes down to what specific types of patrons can offer that others cannot.
Great. If I could briefly ask a question also. I have questions for both Georgi and Ivan, as well as Israel. So for Georgi and Ivan, actually all of these questions are just sort of clarification, so it might just be in the paper, in which case, forgive me. So for Georgi and Ivan, the question is, what is the relationship between road building and metro building? Are these in different areas, or is there something else going on that makes some places get selected for both roads and for metros? I can imagine that, like, if you've got a road, you don't need a metro, but it could also be that there's just some areas that are being more economically developed, and therefore you're building both of them, which means that these sort of effects would be very related to each other. I just sort of be interested in seeing basically empirically what the relationship is, and if there's any sort of theoretical relationship between them as well. For Israel, I have a bunch of questions, but just to sort of like put it down into one. Well, first, like I definitely second Dina's comment about adding something about resource spreads, because I think that's something that's really, really important. But also sort of on a related note, the one sort of name that I saw in your literature review that I saw missing was Henry Hale's work on political machines. And it seems like a lot of your work about resources is, or political resources and political connections is Moscow centric. The other way that you could get resources, maybe you're controlling this for a little bit with your measure of time in the region, but it's also things like ethnic identity. So when we're thinking about Tatarstan or Bashkortostan or Yakutia, these are going to be very, very important issues that will give you some sort of degree of power, not necessarily threatening to the center, at least not in the sense of like potentially replacing the president, though another type of set if we look at the threat, if we look at the 1990s. But these are things that I think are really, really important to think about and to potentially look at in future iterations of this project. Oh, but thank you all for very, very fascinating presentations. Great panel, great Saturday afternoon.
Okay, so I can answer my question, I think ours, yeah?
Yes, sure. I think that, yes, we can start already answering comments and questions. Yeah, and if you have any additional comments or questions, I don't think we have time for that, but please, you can write them in the chat and we will try to save the chat. Mm-hmm.
So, like, very interesting questions regarding the relationship between roadworks and metro construction. Actually, if you will see on spatial distribution of both new metro station and roadworks, there's no so much correlation because roadworks were more likely to be done in firstly central areas with very large sidewalk beautification campaign, and second regarding new highways repairments in more suburban areas, while metro is only suburban areas where there was no new metro before. Of course, like metro construction is followed by some infrastructural development as roadworks as well, but spatially correlation is not that big. So yeah.
Do you want also to reply to Israel's comments, some of them, or?
Okay, Israel comments, of course. So yeah, I think that in this presentation we tried to make more emphasis on our empirical part, so just some results that we have, and we didn't tell a lot about our theory, but still a part of this project were my thesis project, so I could, for example, send you my thesis where there's like big section of theory and a simple model of infrastructure policy, so it will clarify something for you, for example. Yeah, so maybe it will be a better option, but still we have some rationale behind all of this project. Maybe it seems to be unclear in 12 minutes talk, but still, yeah.
Yes, and this idea that these projects under uncertainty of hybrid regimes they actually lead to people thinking whether I will live up to the moment when I'm granted a flat, for example, in a renovated building, and whether my vote can help secure this flat, for example. Or when it comes to roadwork reconstruction, the payoff is more immediate. So in the theoretical part, we actually try to address that by making kind of framework on how the time horizon compares to what you get as a payoff. But like this is a very interesting theme, and we'll try to adjust the framework for that. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. So now maybe others who want to also can respond both to comments and questions.
May I, if you don't mind? First, I would like to thank Israel and Dina Yanovna for your comments and suggestions. First, I would like to answer Israel's question on what patrons can do for clients and vice versa, what clients can do for their patrons. Actually, not all good relations with federal level actors imply patron-client relations between them. Yeah, as I said, according to definition, patron-client relation mean exchange of resources within a hierarchy. Yeah, and secondly, patron takes care about his or her client during his or her political career. So it's not no, just a project. No, it's a long-term story. As for examples, I remember, for example, Sobyanin's successor in Tyumen, Yakushev, who became a housing minister after that. So Sobyanin promoted him to be a successor in Tyumen, and after that fostered promotion to federal level. So this it's connected because Sobyanin, we mentioned it, realizes, implements housing renovation in Moscow. So he meets his loyal minister, housing minister in federal government. Yeah, and after that, Yakushev helps Sobyanin to implement housing renovation in Moscow. One more example shortly, Rotenberg family promotes a governor in the region, and the governor says that roads in the region, highways, are bad, in a bad condition. And after that, the newly elected governor proclaims a year of roads and highways reconstruction. And all procurements and public contracts goes to Rotenberg's companies. Yeah, so Rotenberg has its own interest to promote the governor to get procurement in the region. So there are a lot of examples with that. Sibur, the company of Timchenko and Mikhilson in Amurskaya Oblast, in Yamalo-Nenetsky district, and so on. But as I said, not all the regions are good as a resource base, and actually it is connected if federal patrons are engaged in appointing governor or not. Yeah, we should check it and test more and more, but intuition says that it's trustworthy. And shortly on Dina Yanovna's comment, yes, the methodology was 2 steps, as I said, and firstly we interviewed experts on connections between newly elected, newly appointed governors and federal patrons. But after that, we checked this information using biography studies, using decision-making analysis, as I said, decisions in favor of patrons and vice versa. So we analyzed decisions like that. We analyzed conflicts in the regional elites and between regional and federal elites. So it's not 100% guarantee Yeah, but we have several indications, and we may explain why these two persons are connected, what indicates on their interpersonal ties. So, and this is the ground for further research. Engagement and involvement of federal patrons could be one of the predictors for appointing governor, but not the only one. Yeah, and it's easier to analyze replacement of governor, but it's hard to analyze. Yeah, we may analyze performance, economic performance, socio-economic situation in the region, and so on. And it's hard to evaluate and assess factors that influence appointing governor. Yeah. So we are trying to create a base to prove from this side, from patron-client relations, but it's not the only one, not the only explanation. Thank you. Oh, maybe Vitaly.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I would like shortly to add Evgeny's answer about question about why we didn't use statistical analysis and use some biographical data. So in Russian regions, in regions that we analyzed, there are some examples where statistical data, for example, economical statistic, GDP per capita, they didn't play the key role in some actions like resigning of governors, re-elections of governors, and over. So, for example, when governor of St. Petersburg, Georgy Poltavchenko, resigned and his successor, Alexander Beglov, took place, St. Petersburg was the second in Russia, the second region which based on statistics like GDP and GDP per capita. But so it was very successful regions, and if you look only on economical statistics, and if you look on some socio-economical statistics, for example, on life expectancy, on the succession of medicine, and over, we could say that St. Petersburg is successful regions, and its governor must took another term. But we saw that Poltavchenko take another position because he hadn't some strong patterns like Alexander, like Beglov, and because of it, they take another governor. So, of course, we in the future we would like to test some other hypotheses with help of other instruments. But now we, like Evgeny said, we use two structure methods, and we prove it with our results. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would also quickly like to thank Israel for the comments. I took note of them. These are mostly questions we're discussing among ourselves as well. Yes, the NPF does look at policy outcomes as well, too, not political outcomes, but policy outcomes. For the time being, we're focusing on what strategies non-democratic regimes have to communicate to the public, which the audience is the public, but also what strategies the opposition has to communicate to the public. And we think per se this is already interesting. When it comes to the comparison of the cases, yes, these cases are different in terms of conflictuality. And the NPF says that debates take place differently depending on how conflictuous this is, and we will want to see. And when it comes to how applicable it is in authoritarian regimes, yes, you're right, we have to focus also on where it is not applicable, and this is also something we want to do. What is really interesting for us is what we saw is actually the hypothesis that we tested, we corroborated them extremely. So actually it works much better here than it works in democratic regimes. And this is for me quite interesting. But I did the analysis just last week. So this is all very new. We have just been working on this for 3 months. So yeah, we continue, and thanks for the comments. Maybe my colleagues want to add something, but
yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, thanks for the comments, Israel. And a lot of the comments are or questions are questions that I've been thinking about as well. And I think, you know, as a kind of a novice with MPF, some of these questions are approached by adding in other policy frameworks like advocacy coalition and that kind of thing. But even still, I think there is a lot of work to do. And what I think is interesting is thinking about MPF as part of kind of a different heterodox ways of using NPF can be really interesting by taking into account things like political power. Probably I wouldn't look at political outcomes, but yeah, I mean there are lots of different ways that MPF can match with other kinds of political studies. But kind of what it does, I think it does well, and it's interesting, you know. But yeah, so we're just in the process of working through all that, and we're about not quite halfway through the NUG yet, so there is some time to do that. But thanks for the questions.
Sorry, had a mouse malfunction here, trying to click on the button. So thank you also very much for the comments. To answer sort of Dina's question and actually Caroline's question sort of together. So the paper actually comes from something that I published, God, like 4 years ago now, a long time ago, where we actually were trying to specifically think about this question of the use of multiple strategies simultaneously within the framework of elections. Because in political science, there's like, well, sometimes you give money to your supporters and sometimes you give money to the easily persuadable, and the literature like finds both. And so we actually show in Russia that the reason you probably found both in other settings is because it just depends on the economic situation. Sometimes you use one, sometimes you use the other. And I mean, again, Russia is not the rest of the world, but if it works here, there's reason to suspect it'll work elsewhere. You know, some journal, the journal bought it, so we'll see. So here in this particular paper, there is a discussion of elections, but honestly, given that we had published that previous paper and given that the paper has a lot of coherence issues, I wanted to focus specifically on the elite strategy. And so elections come into this mostly as a control variable. So there's, I skipped over the tables because I didn't want to glaze anybody's eyes over, but basically in the statistical results, I show the independent effect of elections, the independent effect of elites, and then the effect of like what happens when you do both, right? Because it could be the case that controlling for electoral outcomes that might drive the strategy, elites don't matter, or vice versa, right? So here's specifically the literature thinks about the extent to which the dominant party wins elections. So the more you win, the more the region is supportive of you, and that might be a reason they get money. Or alternatively, if you win but by small amounts, that region is more persuadable, it's more marginal, and you might want to pump money into there. So it's a measurement thing. But regardless, this elite dynamic holds even accounting for other political reasons that you might send money. They both matter. Again, as I mentioned in the talk, the magnitude is really similar, which I found surprising. I thought one would be much more important than the other. So moving on, thanks, Stina, for this comment on economic growth. I actually hadn't thought of that. I don't know if that's something to deal with in this paper per se. It's certainly something to keep in mind. It's also potentially another paper. If you're interested, the data's there. This can be tested. But yeah, I mean, I do agree with you, although my impression, just based on anecdotally who the well-connected people are, they tend to not be loyalists in the sense of like Trump White House loyalists. They tend to be people who, just because of the way the measure is constructed, they're people who have been sitting around the federal bureaucracy for a really long time, right? Like it's not an accident that Matvienko, he is one of the most politically connected people in this thing, right? So Gardeev, if he were in the data, because this ends in 2008, he would also be well connected because he was the federal agriculture minister for forever. So a lot of these people are less political and seem more technocratic. That would be something that would be interesting to test, right? You could try to figure out a way to differentiate that. I don't do it here in this paper, but that would be like it'd be thinking about the competence versus loyalty of the well-connected. And so finally, to Kyle's two comments, and I apologize, my 1-year-old just woke up if you can hear screaming in the background. So actually the Hale argument, I don't cite it and I should, and Henry will beat me up later, I'm sure, but the Hale argument actually motivates this idea of the independently powerful regional elites, right? So people with independent power bases. And so a lot of his work informs sort of econometrically how I tried to differentiate those guys from the just well-connected, because as a general rule, some of the well-connected are very powerful within their regions. It does happen, so like Lushkov, for example, but in general, once you control for the regional characteristics, you should be able to identify just the connections themselves, assuming that you've measured power correctly, which I would argue that it's really coarse in this work. It's one of the things that needs to be improved. And then finally, you know, the stupid answer to this natural resource question is, well, they're regional fixed effects. But I take that point, and I think it's possible to control for the, I think there's good data on the amount or the value of the natural resources being extracted. I don't honestly think it'll make a difference, but, you know, toss it in, maybe it will. That, to be honest, that actually might also be useful because that might be a good alternative measure of independent power bases, right? So that might be useful even as a substantive variable. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else wants to reply to comments? Okay, so if no, I guess that we can close this session. Well, thank you very much for being here and well, being here in Zoom and being here on Saturday afternoon. I'm sorry that we are much over time, but I think that that was for the sake of fruitful discussion. I think that we did have some, you know, good comments. Okay, so thank you very much. Well, stay healthy and safe.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye, thanks.